The moment he touched the portrait, the painted lips moved, whispering his name in the exact voice of the woman he buried 6 months ago. Tonight's story begins in a quiet house where grief hangs heavier than the dust on forgotten frames. A man tries to move on, but a single portrait refuses to let him forget. Because sometimes love never dies, and sometimes it refuses to stay silent. After his wife's sudden passing, Nathan locked himself away in silence. But the silence didn't stay empty. It waited, breathing, until he finally entered her old art room. Nathan had always believed that silence was simply the absence of sound. But after she was gone, he learned silence had weight. It pressed against his ribs, sat heavy in his throat, and clung to the walls of the house like a living thing. Days blurred into nights, and nights into a colorless fog, where no matter how long he stared at the ceiling, sleep refused to show mercy. People told him to get out, breathe air, see friends, occupy himself. But people didn't understand that grief builds its own commandments. And Nathan obeyed them all. He lived in routine: wake, sit, stare at the empty space beside him, where she used to lay. Eat only when the ache in his stomach felt worse than the ache in his heart. Walk from room to room, like a ghost haunting his own life. Her laugh used to fill the house like warm sunlight. She painted in every corner, on canvases, on napkins, on the backs of receipts she found in his pockets. Her art room was her sanctuary, a place blooming with brushes, half-finished sketches, color palettes, and the faint scent of oils. After she died, Nathan shut the door and turned the key, sealing it not just to preserve her memory, but to protect himself from it. Her unfinished canvas stood inside like a wound he wasn't ready to touch. He couldn't bear the idea of stepping into the room where she had spent her final afternoon, where she hummed a song he could barely remember now. Every time he walked past that door, he felt the silence leaning out from underneath it, breathing softly like a trapped animal, waiting for him to open it. Weeks passed, then months, and slowly something shifted in the quiet. It was subtle at first, a sensation, a presence he couldn't describe. He would wake at night and swear he heard a soft brushstroke, the faint clink of a glass jar, or the rustle of a canvas being moved. Not loud enough to call a noise, but not faint enough to ignore. The silence wasn't passive anymore. It was watching him, urging him, pleading for him to remember the room he had abandoned. One evening, as the sunset spilled bruised red across the walls, Nathan's hand drifted toward the doorknob to her art room. His fingers trembled, not from fear of the room itself, but from fear of what opening it meant. It meant acknowledging that she was truly gone. It meant daring to confront a space frozen in time, with every brushstroke echoing her heartbeat. He took a breath that felt too heavy, too deep, and turned the key. The door opened with a soft exhale, as if the room had been holding its breath for him. Dust danced in the dying light. Her easel still waited. Her palette still held dried swirls of midnight blue and soft ivory. The chair was angled just the way she left it. And in that instant, Nathan realized the silence hadn't been empty at all. It had been waiting for him to come home. Her final painting of herself hung above the mantel. Her eyes followed him with unsettling precision, as if the canvas still carried the warmth of her gaze. Nathan had always admired her portraits, but this one, this last self-portrait, felt different since the day she died. He remembered the hours she spent working on it, the soft strokes of her brush, the way she tilted her head as if studying her own reflection, not for accuracy, but for meaning. She never explained why she wanted to paint herself one final time. She simply smiled, brushed a lock of hair from her eyes, and said, "Sometimes you need to see yourself the way the world never will." He didn't understand then. Now, looking up at the painting, he feared he never truly would. She had captured herself with almost uncomfortable clarity. The slight curve of her lips, the depth in her eyes, the glimmer of a secret thought hiding behind them. But there was something else, something he never noticed while she was alive. A layer beneath the colors, a tension around the edges, a heaviness in the expression that he could not explain. When he stood in front of the portrait, it felt less like he was observing art and more like he was standing in the presence of someone waiting to speak. The longer he stared, the more the room seemed to shift around him. Shadows stretched in ways they shouldn't. The air thickened as though holding invisible breath. He found himself glancing away every few seconds, then glancing back, unable to shake the feeling that her eyes had moved by the time he looked again. They weren't static, painted shapes. They were aware, watching, measuring his reactions with the same tenderness she used when he came home exhausted from work. One evening, he tried an experiment. He stepped to the far left of the room. Her eyes followed. He moved to the right. Again, they shifted subtly. Not like a trick of perspective, but like a living gaze tracking him. A chill slid down his spine. He whispered her name, just to break the tension, hoping the sound of his voice would shatter the illusion. But the illusion held. As he stood there, memories pressed against him like unseen fingertips. He remembered how she used to look at him when she thought he wasn't paying attention. Soft, studying, silently loving him through her gaze alone. That warmth had always comforted him. Now, it felt like a weight he couldn't escape. He stepped closer, heart thudding, and for a moment he swore the painted eyes softened. Just slightly. Just enough for him to wonder if the canvas knew him the way she did. If a part of her lingered in the strokes, trapped between pigment and memory, waiting for him to understand something she never spoke aloud. The closer he came, the more the warmth of her gaze seemed to rise from the surface, faint but real, like the last breath of a fading ember. The house felt unbearably quiet, but not empty. No, never empty. Not while that portrait watched him with the same intensity she once did. And in that moment, he realized the truth that made his skin prickle. The painting wasn't just looking at him. It was trying to tell him something. One stormy night, lightning cracked, and faintly, the portrait whispered, "Nathan, you forgot the truth." He froze. The voice was hers. Not similar, not close, exact. For a moment, he thought the storm had played a cruel trick on his ears. Wind howled through the cracks of the old house. Rain hammered the windows, and thunder rolled like an angry beast pacing the sky. But none of those sounds could mimic her voice. Warm, melodic, unmistakable. His breath stalled in his chest as he stared at the portrait, waiting, hoping, fearing that he had imagined it. His mind raced for some rational explanation, stress, exhaustion, grief twisting his senses. He had heard her voice in dreams, in memories, in the quiet moments when he closed his eyes. But not like this. Never like this. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the room in a harsh, white glare. The painting's face lit up for a heartbeat, a frozen echo of the woman he had loved. Her painted eyes seemed deeper, the shadows beneath them more pronounced, as if the storm had awakened something hidden in the layers of pigment. Nathan took a slow step backward, afraid that sudden movement might provoke whatever this was. His pulse thundered louder than the rain. The room returned to darkness. The storm outside raged on. Nathan waited, every muscle tense, his ears straining for any hint that the whisper had been real. Seconds felt like minutes. Then, soft, trembling, impossibly familiar, the voice came again. Nathan, his name, her tone. The very way she used to say it when she wanted to tell him something serious, something delicate. The voice carried no distortion, no echo, no hint of imagination. It was her, as alive as she had been the day. She held his face in her hands and told him she loved him. A certainty sank into Nathan like cold iron. He hadn't imagined it. His legs nearly buckled as he stepped closer to the portrait. Drawn by fear and longing woven together so tightly he couldn't tell them apart. The painting's lips hadn't moved. They were still brushstrokes, lifeless, still perfectly fixed. But the voice seeped from somewhere within the canvas, as if the art itself held lungs and breath and memory. "You forgot," the whisper breathed, fragile but insistent. Every hair on Nathan's arms stood on end. He didn't dare speak. He didn't dare break the spell. A rush of questions flooded him. What truth? Why now? Was he losing his mind? Or had she left something behind? Something buried beneath grief and time. Something she needed him to remember. The storm outside grew fiercer, pushing wind against the windows like fists trying to break in. But inside the room, the air grew strangely still, as if the world held its breath along with him. Nathan felt his heart stutter under the weight of a truth he wasn't sure he wanted. Because if the voice was real, then everything he believed about grief, death, and final goodbyes was suddenly unraveling. The painting seemed to lean toward him, though it hadn't moved. The darkness around it pulsed with quiet expectation. "Nathan," the voice whispered again, softer now, almost pleading. "You forgot the truth." And in that chilling moment, he realized something far more terrifying than a ghostly whisper. Whatever truth he had forgotten, she wasn't going to let him ignore it anymore. The whispers grew nightly, revealing private memories, where she hid her letters, the lullaby she hummed when nervous, even the final argument they never resolved. At first, Nathan tried to convince himself that the whispers were fragments of memory, echoes of her voice, triggered by grief and exhaustion. But memories don't choose new things to reveal. Memories don't speak with intention. And memories certainly don't tell you something you never knew. The second night, as he lay awake listening to the rain tick against the window, the portrait murmured something soft, so soft he almost missed it. "Behind the blue vase, the one you hated." Nathan's blood chilled. She used to tease him about that vase, calling it the ugliest thing I ever fell in love with. He had never known she hid anything near it. Still half in disbelief, he found himself stumbling into the living room, heart thudding, pulling the vase from the shelf. Beneath it, wedged carefully in a crack between the wall and the baseboard, he found 4 envelopes, each addressed to him in her handwriting. Letters she wrote but never gave. He didn't open them, not yet. Something held him back. Fear, confusion. The surreal dread of discovering her secrets through a painting instead of memories. He slipped them into his pocket and returned to the portrait, staring into those painted eyes as if seeking an explanation. But the portrait stayed silent that night, as if it had said enough. The next whisper came 3 nights later, just as he began drifting to sleep. A gentle melody hummed through the dark, thin as a thread of breath. His eyes snapped open. It was the lullaby she used to hum when she was anxious, her voice trembling slightly on certain notes. He had forgotten the tune in the blur of grief, but now it spilled into the room with perfect clarity. Slow, familiar, heartbreakingly tender. She hummed it on the nights she couldn't sleep, on the mornings she felt overwhelmed, and once, on the day she told him she feared she was losing herself. As the portrait hummed, memories flashed like lightning. Her pacing barefoot across the kitchen floor, her fingers twisting the hem of her shirt, her voice quivering as she tried to hide how frightened she really was. Nathan felt tears sting his eyes. The lullaby wasn't just a song. It was a confession. And now she was humming it again, from a world she no longer inhabited, urging him to remember the fragility she carried so quietly. But the whisper that shook him most came a week later, long after the humming had stopped. The night was silent, heavy. He was seated in front of the mantel, staring at the portrait with a mixture of dread and longing. For a while, nothing happened. Then, suddenly, a whisper slid through the stillness. Why never finish that fight? Nathan's breath caught. That argument, the one they had hours before the accident, was the memory he avoided most. They had argued about trust, about fear, about something she wanted to tell him but hesitated to say. He had walked away angry. She had gone quiet. And by the time he returned to apologize, she was gone forever. Hearing her mention it, hearing her want to return to it, felt like the ground beneath him cracked open. The whispers were no longer memories. They were messages. And she wasn't done speaking. The portrait murmured a secret she never dared speak in life. That someone had been watching her, entering their home while Nathan slept. He wanted what we had. The voice trembled. Nathan felt the air drain from his lungs, as if the room itself had suddenly shrunk. The words crawled across his skin like cold fingers. He stared at the painting, waiting for the tremor in her voice to continue, praying it wouldn't. But silence followed, heavy, oppressive, pulsing with the weight of a truth too terrifying to absorb all at once. Someone had been entering their home. He swallowed hard, trying to steady the shaking in his hands. He should have dismissed it as a hallucination, as grief warping his senses. But the voice hadn't stuttered, hadn't blurred, hadn't felt like memory. It carried fear. Real fear. A fear she had never shown him while alive. A fear she had hidden, buried beneath her smiles, her laughter, her quiet routines. Nathan's mind raced back to small things he once overlooked. The times she startled at harmless sounds. The way she checked the locks twice instead of once. The night she asked him to stay awake with her a little longer. He had chalked it up to anxiety. He had kissed her forehead and told her everything was fine. Now, with the portrait watching him through painted eyes, he felt the sickening realization that everything might not have been fine at all. "Ooh," he whispered, his voice cracking. The portrait didn't answer immediately. Shadows flickered across the room as wind pushed angrily against the windows. Nathan heard the soft creak of the house settling. Normal sounds, harmless noises. But now they all felt sinister. How many nights had someone actually been inside? Moving through their rooms, watching his wife while he slept inches away, unaware. The portrait finally murmured again, voice thinner, tighter, as if pushing the words through fear. "A man. He followed me. I saw him first near the studio, then the market, then home." Nathan's heart sank. She had been stalked. Her silence suddenly made terrible sense. She hadn't wanted to burden him. She hadn't wanted to ignite his anger, to make him fear for her safety. Or perhaps she didn't believe her own instincts. Maybe she'd convinced herself she was imagining it, until she couldn't. The whisper deepened, quivered, as if the memory itself pained her. "He waited until you slept. He walked through our hallways, stood outside the bedroom door. Sometimes I woke first. Sometimes I didn't." Nathan felt his stomach twist. Every night he thought he was protecting her. Every night he thought their home was safe. Someone else had been inside. Someone with intentions he couldn't yet name. Someone who wanted what they had. "Why didn't you tell me?" Nathan breathed, feeling both wounded and helpless. The portrait gave a fragile sigh, one so soft it felt like the echo of a breath. "I tried," the voice whispered. "But fear makes the tongue heavy." And he said if I told you, he'd take everything from us. A chill rooted itself deep inside Nathan's chest. This wasn't just a ghostly confession. It was the unveiling of a threat that had once been real, breathing, alive. And if the man had wanted what they had then, what was stopping him from wanting it still? The storm outside intensified, rattling the windows like fists demanding entry. Nathan stared at the portrait, pulse thundering in his ears. Her voice trembled again. As not gone. Guided by her whispers, Nathan pried open the wall behind her portrait. revealing a journal, photos, and a ring belonging to a man who vanished years ago. For days, the whispers had circled the same message. Behind me, look behind me. At first, Nathan resisted. The idea felt absurd, like grief had pushed him to imagine signs in every shadow. But the whispers persisted, growing sharper, more urgent. Each repetition laced with a trembling breath that felt less like memory and more like desperation. Finally, one night, when the storm had died and the house sat cold and eerily still, he stood before the portrait with a hammer in hand. The painted eyes stared down at him with that strange, living awareness he could no longer deny. He whispered a quiet apology, not sure if it was for doubting her, for disturbing her art, or for what he feared he was about to uncover. The first strike echoed through the room like a gunshot. Dust rained from the edges of the frame. The wall groaned under the pressure. He struck again, and this time the plaster cracked in a jagged line. A third strike, and a section of the wall caved inward, revealing a narrow cavity hidden between the studs. An intentional space, concealed long before the portrait ever hung there. His heart pounded like something alive inside him, tugging him forward. He reached inside and felt cold objects covered in dust. His fingers brushed the edge of a leather cover, brittle with age. He pulled it out, an old journal, its spine warped, pages yellowed and stiff. Beneath it lay a stack of photographs wrapped in cloth, and, tucked neatly in a corner, a ring that glinted faintly even in the dim room. Nathan sank to the floor, the objects spread before him like a ritual offering, each one humming with unease. He didn't recognize the journal. It wasn't hers. The handwriting was unfamiliar. Bold strokes, sharp turns, frantic notations. He flipped through the first pages and immediately recoiled. The entries were obsessive. They described watching a woman, his wife. Not by name, but unmistakably her. The writer had documented where she went, what she wore, when she smiled, when she seemed sad. There were drawings too, rough sketches of her face from different angles, some tender, others dark and distorted by possessive longing. Nathan's breath grew shallow as he sifted through the photos. They showed his wife in places she never mentioned being photographed. At the grocery store, walking home from her studio, sitting alone on a park bench. None were taken with her knowledge. He could tell by her natural posture, the candidness of her movements. Every picture felt like an intrusion, each angle steeped in violation. Then he picked up the ring. It was heavy, silver, engraved on the inside. He rubbed away decades of dust until the initials became clear. GH. A name he recognized from a missing Person case his wife, once mentioned in passing. A man rumored to have vanished without a trace. She had said it casually at dinner, stirring her soup, uninterested in the gossip. Nathan remembered brushing it off too. Now the ring pulsed in his palm, like a trapped memory, finally clawing its way free. His stomach twisted as the truth began to take form. The man who watched her, the man who entered their home, the man she feared, he had been real. And somehow, his obsession had reached far deeper than Nathan ever realized. Behind him, the portrait's whisper drifted through the room, softer than paper, yet heavy with sorrow. You didn't imagine him. I hid the proof, so he could never hurt us again. Nathan looked at the journal, the photos, the ring. The air tightened around him. The wall had not just concealed evidence. It had concealed a warning. And now that warning was awake. That night, the portrait's voice frayed with panic. "He's here." Nathan turned and saw a shadow slipping across the hallway, familiar yet faceless. At first, Nathan's mind refused to accept what he saw. The house had always been quiet at night, eerily so, but never threatening. Even with all the whispers, the hidden journal, the photos, and the ring that proved something dark had once stalked his wife. He'd clung to the thin thread of logic that nothing supernatural was happening. Everything had a reason. Everything had an explanation. But when the portrait's voice cracked with raw fear, when it trembled in a way he had never heard, even when she was alive, that thread snapped. He spun around just in time to catch a glimpse of movement at the end of the hallway. Not the usual flicker of shadows cast by streetlights. Not a trick of the eyes in low light. This shadow moved with intention, slow, gliding, almost gentle, like someone trying not to be heard. Nathan's breath hitched in his throat. The figure was tall, thin, its edges blurring as though it were both solid and smoke. He couldn't see a face, only the vague outline of a head turned toward him, watching. And then the most horrifying part. It wasn't an unfamiliar silhouette. There was something in the posture, the tilt of the head, the quiet stillness that mimicked the man in the photographs. The stalker who had followed his wife. Written about her in that obsessive journal. Left tokens of his presence in the walls. Nathan felt the blood drain from his face. How could a dead man walk? Was he dead? Had he ever died at all? Or had he simply waited, lurking in some corner of the world, or the house, until now? The shadow paused at the far end of the hallway. Nathan couldn't move. His limbs felt cemented to the floor, as if the house itself didn't want him to run. His heart pounded so violently he wondered if the shadow could hear it. The figure shifted slightly, leaning forward with a subtle, deliberate motion, like someone trying to get a better look. "Nathan," the portrait whispered, voice breaking. "Don't let him in." Too late. The house already felt invaded. A coldness seeped from the hallway, curling around the corners of the room, carrying a faint, rotten scent Nathan hadn't noticed before. He realized with icy dread that the shadow wasn't just passing by. It was approaching. Slowly, steadily, closer. Nathan stumbled backward, his fingers grasping the mantel as he fought to stay upright. Every instinct screamed at him to hide, to run, to protect himself from something deeply wrong, something that had crossed a boundary between the living and whatever lay beyond reason. Yet, he couldn't tear his eyes away. The shadow glided another step forward. The walls seemed to narrow as it came. The floor creaked under a weight that shouldn't belong to something without form. For a fleeting second, Nathan thought he saw part of a hand, long, thin, reaching. Then the portrait behind him whispered one final warning, its voice shredded with terror. "Never left, Nathan. He was waiting for you." The shadow stopped just inches from the doorway, silent and watching. And in that terrible stillness, Nathan understood that whatever haunted his wife in life had finally come for him. The wind burst from the portrait like a final breath she had been holding since the day she died. A release of everything she never managed to say while living. It swept through the house with a force that rattled every window pane, overturning frames, scattering papers, and sending a chill through Nathan that felt both protective and sorrowful. In the deafening rush, he heard her voice, faint, fading, but certain, telling him the words she had never spoken aloud when she was alive. That he had always been her courage, the shield she leaned on, the presence that held her steady even on the days she pretended she didn't need anyone. Now that presence had to exist within him, not because she was gone, but because her final act could only carry him so far. The shadow staggered backward, its form flickering like a half-remembered nightmare exposed to daylight. It clung to the doorway, fighting the wind, as though the house itself had turned against it. Nathan watched, trembling, as the darkness peeled from the walls and retreated, shrinking into the corners, like an instinctive animal afraid of being truly seen. The wind surged harder, gathering strength, pulling from the portrait a soft glow, as if her spirit, trapped in pigment and canvas, finally tore free. For a moment, he saw her silhouette in the swirl, graceful, calm, resolute. She wasn't looking at the shadow. She was looking at him. Then everything stopped. The wind died in an instant, leaving the house in a heavy, aching silence. Shattered glass glimmered across the floor like scattered stars. The portrait hung crooked, the frame splintered. Its surface cracked as if the painting had exhaled so forcefully. It broke the boundaries of its own existence. Yet her eyes, those painted eyes, had dimmed. They no longer followed him. They no longer watched anything. Whatever bound her to the canvas had left with the wind. Nathan stood there, heart hammering, breath unsteady, waiting for the shadow to return. It didn't. No footsteps. No whisper. Just the settling creaks of a house that had finally let go of a secret too heavy to carry. But the danger wasn't what stayed with him. It was her final message. You were my courage. Now you must be your own. The words echoed through him, not haunting but steadying. They pressed against his grief, not to erase it, but to shape it into something new, something strong. He realized then that she hadn't saved him because he was weak. She had saved him because she believed he could survive without her. She had pushed the shadow away, not so he could retreat back into fear, but so he could step forward into a life where he understood his own strength. Nathan knelt beside the broken frame, touching the paint that still felt warm, as if her presence lingered for one last heartbeat. He whispered, "Thank you," though he knew she wasn't there to hear it. Or maybe she was, but not in the portrait anymore. Not trapped, not waiting. She had set him free just as much as she had freed herself. And as he rose, the house felt different, lighter, empty in a way that hurt but didn't terrify. The shadow was gone. The whispers had ended, but something else had begun, a quiet, steady resolve inside him, a courage he had mistaken for hers all these years, finally revealing itself as his own.